Well, here we are. I'm just going to introduce the show and then we'll get right into it. Okay, Derek? Well, this is Mountain Standard Time, and I'm your host, Nathan Giede. It's our inaugural show here with the Western, and I'm proud to be here, joined by all of you happy warriors within the Western Canadian milieu and fighting for a fair deal for us. Here in British Columbia, there have always been tensions between us and our sister province, Alberta. And in this inaugural episode, I'm going to speak with Derek Fildebrandt, our head honcho over at the West, to give his take on how to bridge those gaps that are often filled between us by the Rockies, demarcating Pacific and Mountain Standard Time. For my own part, I'd argue that a divide and conquer mentality from Ottawa is keeping us all down in the West. Indeed, is keeping us down anywhere where that isn't the Laurentian Seaway. And quite frankly, keeping us Westerners divided pays too well. Entire industries are made out of it in the federal capital, from equalization to resource development, from the approval by the Supreme Court or the challenge industry thereof to Indigenous affairs. In other words, it pays to be bad in Canada. The joke being, of course, that we used to have both legal and cultural barriers to such behavior. In the church I follow, we used to call that calumny, and where an entire society, institution, or even country has fallen into a state of such corruption that there is no virtue to be found. And such a situation requires redemption, or for the most cancerous parts to be cut out and discarded. Indeed, that's the only way to save the rest of any person. Here in BC, we're lucky to have been blessed with an abundant amount of natural resources and a population that is both well-educated and hardworking. We have a large coastline and good infrastructure to get goods from the rest of Canada to the Pacific and from the international market back into the rest of this dominion. But more development in these capacities has been stymied over the years. The fact of the matter is this frustrates our sister province, and I understand why. I think it's right to a point. But if I am to earn my spot here at this table, if this show is to be a success, then bridging those gaps in understanding so that proper partnership can occur between the most beautiful place on earth and Wild Rose Country must be our purpose. Things will not get better for Western Canada until BC and Alberta can learn to cooperate. If that teamwork ever manifests, even Ottawa can't stop us. During the show, please feel free to comment and let us know what topics you think need to be discussed in order to create more cohesion in the West so we can get a fair deal for our families. Please also feel free to email myself or the Western Standard about guests from BC primarily, but also from throughout Western Canada to discuss meaningful topics around sovereignty, partnership, and Western identity, and how we can make life better for Western Canadians. I can't do this alone. Our only hope for a brighter future is to work together. Some of these opening statements will be longer and shorter, depending on the day. Feel free to also comment about the show's format and how that might be improved. But please, please, please be patient. We don't have the endless billions of dollars the CBC does. For now, sit back and relax while I bring on my first guest, Derek Fildebrandt, publisher, president, and CEO of the Western Standard. Welcome to the program, boss.
Well, there we go.
There we are.
Early technical difficulties. How you doing, Nathan?
I'm doing all right. We're on our training wheels today.
Oh, I think it's going pretty well so far. Thanks so much for stepping up into the role. We're excited to have you, Nathan, as the Western Standard's first BC political columnist. Well, first since the creation of the new Western Standard, I should say. But our BC political columnist and host of Western Standard Time. We're really happy to have you. I'm real honored to be on your first show.
Derek, I mean, one of the things that perhaps our first set of listeners, but also people who regularly tune into the Western Standard might want to just kind of reiterate or visit again is how did the Western Standard come to be, both in its new iteration and what happened to the Western Standard we knew from days of yore?
Well, I remember the old Western Standard launched while I was still in university. I was going to Carleton University, which is pretty much a Marxist training camp. And there really wasn't a lot of good material to read. I remember I would go around the library and I'd search the database for anything good, and I'd get some Tom Flanagan and Preston Manning here and there, but it really wasn't very much good. And I got a phone call one day from a telemarketer saying, "Hey, do you hate the CBC? You hate the Globe and Mail? Do you hate all the, you sick of the mainstream media? Do you want to sign up to this new thing?" And even though I was living in the East at the time, I said, absolutely, sign me up. And so I got in the practice actually of eating Mr. Noodles about 2 weeks a month so I could afford my Western Standard subscription. I'm back to eating them now, funny enough, because working at the Western Standard is an ongoing financial challenge, but getting better. So we, I signed up. I was just a reader at the time. I remember I'd get my Western Standard in the mail every week, and I'd open up immediately to the back cover and read Mark Stein. That was the best part of it, and it really hooked me. And the Western Standard closed its doors. The first Western Standard closed its doors in 2007. So it only went a few years. It never really made sense to me why, and I never really understood why it closed its doors until I purchased rights to the Western Standard as we got ready to create this Western Standard that we have now. It had a huge subscription. Its advertising and subscription rates were growing about 100% year over year. It had a bit of a expensive editorial budget, but it didn't seem really closed down for financial reasons that made sense to me. I think it really just closed down as in the background, Sun News Network was preparing to launch. And I can tell you as a business owner, it's a lot easier to collect a salary than to run a business. So I think some of the folks involved at the time thought Sun News Network was just going to be the big thing. And it's too bad it didn't work out. But Sun News Network was premised on it's a regulated medium with the CRTC, and I don't think any business model that relies on government approval is a very good business model. And so it largely closed down for reasons outside of financial or subscriptions. But we decided. I sat down with a few folks over the summer of 2019. I was kind of planning my next moves, and I set on doing this. It became apparent to me that I actually, I knew, I didn't really realize at the time, but I knew the guy who actually had bought the rights to the old Western Standard. So I acquired that. We founded the new company, which is now called Western Standard New Media Corporation. I couldn't just register to Western Standard Media Corporation because the name for that wasn't coming open for about another month. These things go away in the corporate registries. So we founded it. We spent the first 14 months just building the readership, the brand, the credibility of the Western Standard. We wanted it to be something very different from a lot of the other alternative media out there. I don't want anyone to take this as bashing some of the other alternative independent media out there. I love what they're doing. They're playing an important role. But I felt that the alternative media was lacking an outlet that had a clear separation of news and opinion. They tend to often muddy them quite a bit. And I wanted our news side to be genuinely independent, fair, and using kind of those best practices that we at least expect the mainstream media to hold themselves to, even if they very often don't. So we brought in some great people on our news side. We had brought in. Go ahead.
Well, I think that's exactly kind of the issue, is that one of the reasons that everything stays so mainstream in Canada is that that's the only thing that looks professional or supposedly has any legitimacy. I personally think there's, of course, a lot of fake news that does go through the mainstream media of Canada, but nonetheless, it looks polished, it looks good, it's got a perfect website or whatever. They got, $1 billion from the taxpayer, or they have such exclusive oligarchic contracts and monopolies that they, of course, have lots of revenue, and so everything looks pretty, but this is the thing for alternative media in Canada, is that it has to fight that uphill battle. Have you found that yourself?
Yeah, but we gained. The funny thing about the Western Standard, while we are not mainstream media, but we have a certain degree of mainstream acceptance that a lot of other alternative media don't. I think it's because our news. We're not the only one, but we're very rare in this, that we have a strict separation between our news and opinion. So our news division is led by Dave Naylor, our news editor. He spent 40 years in media, most of it at the Calgary Sun. He was the city editor there for about 20 years. And he brought a large sense of professionalism and credibility. So you're opposite Mike Demore, our brand new BC bureau chief. He heads the news in British Columbia for the Western Standard. He came on the same day formally as you did. He also comes from the mainstream media. What we've been doing is we've been recruiting most of our reporters from the mainstream media who are just kind of sick of the mainstream media. The mainstream media tends to pay better than the alternative media in most cases, not always, but it has a certain stability to it. You're working for big established names that at least one point were highly respected. So what we're doing is we're finding disenfranchised, good, honest reporters in the mainstream media, trying to pull them out and bring them into the Western Standard. But we couple that with our opinion side. And I take a more active role in our opinion side. I double up as the opinion editor for the time being. I'm hopeful to hire someone else to take that over in time. But the opinion side, because no one would believe I'm an objective, fair reporter. I think I've been on the record enough to know that I'm not able to write a very fair news story, I think, and even if I tried. But the opinion side, we've got some really great columnists who are not afraid. They take on the controversial issues that the mainstream media are often too afraid to take on. But often the Western Standard, we found ourselves to be the tail wagging the dog of the mainstream media because our writers and our reporters conduct themselves with professionalism. We often break stories that the mainstream media don't really think about, but then they end up picking it up a few days later. So we're extremely pleased with the progress we've had. We began to monetize the Western Standard in February. I know some people don't like the paywall, but there's really kind of two options here. We can take government money and be servants of the state, or we can be genuinely independent media. And that means we ask people to step up and give a couple of bucks a month to fund what we do. And tons of people have. We've been really happy with the reception we've had so far on that.
Something that you mentioned earlier was, of course, the fact that it was difficult to see why the Western Standard had to go before, and now that it's back, obviously there's been a lot of, maybe the other way to think about it too is that in Canada it does feel like there's a bit of a vacuum on, well, to the right of center part of the spectrum, both in our political parties but also in our news media. Does the Western Standard kind of fill that role?
Well, we certainly do on the opinion side. The opinion side is, you don't need to look too hard to figure out where we're coming from. We're militantly proud of being Westerners. And there's a spectrum of that. We've got some columnists who are full-on sovereigntists and some who would be firewallers. If you're just we love Ottawa Federalist, well, you've got the mainstream media to write in, so we don't really feel the need to provide much space for that. On the opinion side, though, on the news side, as I said, we try to make it very fair and right down the middle. But what separates us is we cover stories that the mainstream media often just don't. Sometimes they deliberately ignore it, but sometimes they just don't see why it's an issue until they start seeing a Western Standard story in their social media feeds, getting tons of shares, and then they say, "Oh, well, crap, we're missing out on a story," and then they'll pick it up a few days later. Sometimes it's just that they don't see it's a story, they don't think it's important until that they see it's gaining traction, and then they'll pick it up. So we are filling a void. And it's also sometimes just in the perspective of things. I mean, for example, when a government sends out a news release saying XY minister announces $30 million investment in excellent social program, the media will generally take that news release and reprint it almost word for word. And if it's a conservative government in power, then they'll go to someone, say, from the NDP or the Liberals, and they'll say, what's your thoughts on this? And then they'll get a quote from them about why it's not enough money. Well, we'll ask for them for quotes too, but we'll go to the other side a lot more. And the language might be different. Governments don't invest money, except in rare cases. In the case of, say, Keystone XL, the Alberta UCP government under Jason Kenney invested quite a bit of money, up between loan guarantees and stock options, $3 billion. In that case, it was technically an investment. It turned out to be a terrible investment, but it was technically an investment, so we can use the term investment. But when governments spend money, 99% of the time, they're not investments. They're spending. So we won't. It's sometimes just language that we question the government's own vocabulary on this because it's spin, and we don't buy government spin from the left or from the so-called right. So we'll talk about government spending. We'll talk about how much money the government had to borrow to do this. We'll go and we'll get quotes from my old colleagues, say at the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. So we'll get a bit more perspective on this, and we just don't take government news releases at their word. We don't just use their language because they're in an official government news release. Problem is, much of the media is just too lazy now. They file 1 or 2 stories a day, and they think that's a lot of work. Our team are filing individually. Each reporter is filing 6, 7, 8 stories a day, sometimes quite a bit more. Maybe I'm just a very hard boss, but our guys work a lot harder, I think, than most of the journalists in the mainstream media. And we've got, and we just question the vocabulary. Whenever I see one of our news stories go out and it's essentially just using the government's words, I make an angry phone call. I say that's not good enough for us. We hold ourselves to a higher standard, the Western standard, and we will use language that we believe is fair, not just what the government tells us to do.
Let's focus on that in itself, right? So the Western Standard, I mean, I'm proud to be here. It's great to be the BC columnist and now, of course, the host of Mountain Standard Time. And of course, the other side of it is that, this is beautiful BC. That's what we're doing over here. BC is a little weird. BC is a little different. We don't have prairies that connect us with the rest of the West. Of course, you guys have the Rockies as well, but then the rest of your Western neighbors, it's a decently easy drive. I've driven it a couple of times. It's not as bumpy as it is over here in BC. How do you make sure that what you're representing isn't just Alberta? You mentioned this in the release where I was announced that the Western Standard can also be the Alberta Standard. How do we make sure that it stays the Western Standard? What's your vision there?
Oh, sorry there. Had a little technical difficulty. This has been an issue we've faced from the beginning of the second Western Standard. Is that we're all too often just the Alberta Plus standard, and that's just because when we started, we didn't start with a lot of loans. I didn't know if this was going to work or not. It's working now, but when we started, I didn't know if this was going to work. Most new businesses fail. We made a vow never to take a penny from government. And frankly, there wasn't a lot of big businesses who were liking what we're doing. So we really just didn't have many avenues of funding. So we started very small. And we started with people making next to nothing, working on sweat equity. Our original people became owners in the company in exchange for their early work because we just really couldn't pay them very much. But so that meant that our original core team was largely just focused around not just Alberta, but just Calgary. And naturally, that meant that our coverage on both news and opinion and broadcast was overwhelmingly Alberta focused. And so let me tell people from Alberta watching right now, we're not going to have less Alberta coverage. We're just going to have more British Columbia coverage, more coverage in Saskatchewan and Manitoba, maybe even the territories at some point, because I think they properly belong, at least in a sense, to the West, even though they're kind of their own thing. So we've now that we've been building up, because we've had a huge number of people decide to become members and subscribe, making small monthly contributions to the Western Standard, and since we've had some a real boon in advertising coming in, we now are able to expand and really be the Western Standard. And so our first really big step with that was bringing you, Nathan, on as BC political columnist and host of the Mountain Standard Time show, and bringing Mike DeMoore on as our BC bureau chief, heading up news in British Columbia. So we needed people on the ground. We tried having people in the Calgary office assigned to BC stories, but we just end up like the Globe and Mail. Like the Globe and Mail's Alberta political columnist is Gary Mason, and he's in Vancouver. It's kind of they have the opposite problem. They got a guy in Vancouver pretending to write about Alberta issues, and anybody reading his stuff knows he just doesn't have anything really thoughtful to say. So. We needed people on the ground here, in British Columbia to do that. And now we're very much aggressively working to do that in Saskatchewan and Manitoba. We have a Manitoba political columnist coming very soon who we're going to be announcing. We've got Lee Harding in Saskatchewan doing opinion. But we're really going to make an effort to truly be the Western standard, not the Alberta Plus standard.
Let's talk about that then. When it comes to BC and Alberta specifically, we are not always the best of neighbors. I think Ottawa's done an incredible job of keeping us divided from one another. From the Alberta perspective, what do you think the reason for that is? Why can't Alberta and BC just get along?
Well, I think it's outside of a province, we tend to project monocultures on each province. Albertans project this monoculture that of the left coast, everybody's sleeping in hemp huts, protesting pipelines, and that's obviously not the case of even. I think that's actually a relatively small number of British Columbians. I don't think it's representative. That and the latte sipper working at a high-tech company in downtown Vancouver for 2 hours a day. I mean, that's kind of the stereotype that gets projected on BC. The stereotype projected on Alberta is we're all roughnecks and cowboys. There's probably a bit more truth to that, but even that is still missing quite a bit. And so those are different cultures. Saskatchewan, it's flat. Everyone's a farmer. So it's, I think it's also because those stereotypes are conflicting stereotypes. One is the rugged individualist. We all live in the country. None of us actually live in a city. I'm in downtown Calgary right now, on the 12th floor here. But I think our stereotypes are different. I think our interests are actually normally quite aligned. And we've got our radical environmentalists too here. The difference is that they're not really able to block others. I don't know why they don't try to block BC lumber shipments down the Trans-Canada Highway. If our radicals were interested in things, they should be standing in Banff, chaining themselves to barricades, stopping lumber from coming through. They're murdering Gaia. So I don't know. But for most, not all, but most of our histories, we've actually been quite aligned. We both our province, the only two provinces that have had social credit governments, and the strange experiment that was. Both provinces were the core of the Reform Party and then the Canadian Alliance. A lot of people don't understand that the Reform Party and the Canadian Alliance used to normally win more seats in British Columbia than the Conservative Party of Canada did. These were these populist Western regional parties that do better than the so-called more mainstream centrist Conservative Party of Canada. Conservative Party of Canada certainly does better in Ontario and the Atlantic and Quebec than the Reform Party ever did. But in BC, the Reform Party did better than the Conservative Party most of the time. Certainly the Canadian Alliance did better more than they did. And so we share a very common political culture that is populist, it's anti-establishment in many cases. But something has happened to make us drift more apart over the last probably 15 years. Both have always been different, but they've normally always seen eye to eye. I mean, Ralph Klein and, you went through a spat of NDP premiers in the death throes of that government before Gordon Campbell was elected. But Ralph Klein found common cause with NDP premiers on federal issues. They regularly stood side by side because the BC NDP at that time, at least, still considered itself clearly a Western party. For most of its history, the NDP was actually a very Western party. Sure, it ran everywhere, but most of its seats were traditionally in Western Canada. That ended in 1993 because the Reform Party, a lot of people understand the Reform Party killed the PCs in the West, but it also pretty much killed the NDP in the West too. It just became the Western Party. It took over both. So regardless of the ideology of the government in power in both Alberta and British Columbia, there was normally a common cause actually between all four Western provinces that we really don't see any. I don't think we see any more at all.
There are secretaries of interprovincial affairs, right? There are people that are designated between the provinces to speak to one another. Is it that high level that has to change, or is it right down to the ground floor, the average guy walking down the street, you or me, that needs to change and have things go forward? That it's our connection that will make the West, able to kind of make a deal for itself in the future.
Well, the easy answer is it's both. I don't think most British Columbians hate Albertans. I don't think most Albertans hate British Columbians. There's obviously some exceptions there. I mean, we all know, like in the summer, you'd get, trucks with Alberta plates getting vandalized in the shoe swaps and stuff. But I think that's a very small, nutty fringe. I think it's just a matter of concentrated interests. I mean, on at least on natural gas extraction, the BC NDP is quite pro because it's in BC. It's got a direct interest in it. The Alberta NDP was quite anti-pipeline, quite anti-oil and gas when it was in opposition, but then it came to government, realized, oh, geez, we won an election and now we have to stay in power and we need money to do it. So I think the reason you have, polls consistently show British Columbians support the oil sands, they support pipelines, they support our fundamental industries. But we hear more about those who are opposed to it vehemently because they're radically opposed to it. They show up and they protest. Whereas those who are supportive of it, well, they just kind of go about their lives. Like, if you're supportive, what really can you do? Not much. Well, okay. And really, would it change how you vote even if you support it? Because it's somebody else's industry. I support certain policies of certain governments in Europe, but it doesn't change how I vote in Canada just because it might align. So even though a majority of British Columbians back pipelines and they back natural resource extraction, doesn't mean that's going to change their vote, because British Columbians have their own concerns to worry about. Similarly, if say the Site C Dam was to have some adverse effects on Alberta, that might change how we vote. But since it doesn't change, it doesn't really affect us. It's kind of meaningless to how we vote here.
So I guess that's exactly it. Like, we're just so siloed from each other in many respects. And then, of course, we have certain opinions of each other. If you have a vision for the West, what is it? How does it look? Are you fully committed to sovereignty, or are you just interested in Ottawa leaving us alone?
Well, it depends on what's possible. My time in politics, I started off as what you might call a hardcore firewaller. I'm an Albertan by choice, not by birth. I came here because it was different, it was special, it aligned more with my values. The people were, I think, I fit in with the people here more than I would in much of Ontario. I came from a little pocket of Ontario called the Ottawa Valley, which I consider the easternmost point of Alberta. It very much shares a lot of its values. So, I'm not one of these people that hates Canada. I think Canada has for all our warts, which every nation has in different forms. Canada is a great nation. It's done great things. It is a leader in the world in many positive respects. Canada is more often than not a net positive to have on the world stage, and I want Canada to succeed. But I don't believe it's acceptable for Alberta in particular, but the West more broadly, to continue a relationship which is colonial in nature. BC and Alberta combined have less senators than Nova Scotia, for God's sakes. There's clearly something wrong with our constitutional arrangements. Confederation happened in 1867 because the four original colonies, or technically three, Upper and Lower Canada were the United Province of Canada at the time, but then Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, because they needed to form an economic and trade union. They needed free trade because the Americans had gone through one of their frequent regurgitations of protectionism, had largely closed off the American market to Canadian producers, and we needed free trade. It was an economic union. the very foundation, like it was not as glorious and romantic as the American Union, which was, to throw off the yoke of British imperialism. Some guys with muskets beat one of the biggest armies in the world, and they founded this great, mostly but not entirely free republic. Ours was not a romantic story like that. It was guys sat around and said, yeah, we need to trade. And it was a practical union of convenience. But that very foundation for the creation of the Dominion of Canada doesn't even exist anymore. We can't trade across provincial boundaries. Legally, if I was to load up my truck with a little too much beer, it's illegal to produce the damn stuff for anybody else, even in your own province, let alone transport across provincial borders. I know a guy who's done jail time for that because he believed he had the right to produce dairy outside of federal government monopoly. So we don't even have free trade in this country. I don't need to rehash, the airing of the grievances, as I called it with on another show, the Canadian Story. The massive wealth transfers that come out of Alberta and the West more broadly to fund the East, largely just for vote buying. And both the Conservatives and the Liberals both engage in it with just one seems to be more gleeful about doing it, and the other is a little more appreciative about doing it, but they both do it in equal measure nonetheless. And basic representation, the right to control provincial policy within our provincial jurisdiction. I'd like to see these things fixed, but I don't believe they can be. The last time we tried to fix the Constitution in Canada was a Charlottetown Accord, and it was mostly just an attempt to appease Quebec with special rights, and the West rejected it, rightfully so, largely leading to the downfall of the Mulroney government. There is no appetite for constitutional change in Canada, and I believe Canada does need constitutional change, but there's no appetite for it, and even if there was an appetite for it, it would get immediately hijacked by a special list of Quebec grievances. We'd say, well, we want an elected Senate. And they'd say, well, we want the right to ban Muslims from wearing headgear. Well, that's a bit of a different agenda. And I'm not sure I want to share country with governments that believe they can so easily trample on religious rights. Although I should point out that right now, Alberta is the biggest violator of religious rights, raiding churches and throwing pastors in prison. But I just don't see the prospect of constitutional reform. I think the best path for Alberta and the West broadly is we need to put some hard demands on the table. We need to say, here is what we require to remain a part of Canada, that it would be a radically reformed Senate, not just in elections, but in how we allocate seats in the Senate. It means free trade. It means the abolition of equalization. And caps on other transfers. A lot of people don't understand that most of the money that comes out of Western provinces towards the East is not equalization. Equalization is just one part of it that we focus on. But we need caps on these things, and we need to guarantee provincial sovereignty within our own jurisdiction. Ottawa's got no more business in healthcare than British Columbia or Alberta do running the army. They're different areas of jurisdiction, and they should be kept strictly separate. I think we should have put this on the table, put it to a vote. But I'm not optimistic one bit that there really would be much take up in Ontario, Quebec, and the Maritimes. And depending on who's in power, John Horgan would probably not even be in favor of a stronger West in terms of our political relationship with the rest of Canada. And failing that, then I think independence needs to very much be on the table. But I'm not one of these people that believes that independence is good in its own right. I believe it is a necessary evil if a serious and goodwill attempt at reform proves to be impossible.
I think something that we could jump off of right there is the fact that it actually does come down to leadership. And so what's kind of interesting is that, you're putting forward these points about watertight compartments and all the rest of it. I, of course, believe mostly in the watertight compartment argument as well, that the sections of the Constitution should be respected, and the division of power should be respected. And it's incredible to me that they're not respected, and that the Supreme Court's affirmed them not being respected. It's beyond me. But let's kind of dive into that for a second. When it comes to even Alberta, Jason Kenney, a man I interned with back in Ottawa, actually, way back in 2012, feels like a million years ago now. I had a lot of respect for the minister at that time. He was the man who was meeting with ethnic groups, trying to bring them into the conservative movement. And he was just very good at what he was doing, networking, trying to keep things going. ever since he became premier, there seems to have been some difficulty and some change. Like, he's getting bad advice, and it seems like Alberta's losing both ways. Internally, it's losing, it's imposing tighter lockdown restrictions, etc. But then also when it comes to Ottawa, Alberta, kind of the champion of the West, if we can use that for now, until more of us in the West come together for that argument. How come they're losing on both sides? They seem to be losing the argument at home and losing the argument abroad.
I think it's because Jason Kenney is not governing as the premier he campaigned to be. Alberta is potentially the only province where a government can campaign on the right and govern in the center. Normally what you do is you campaign in the center. If you're the NDP, you campaign in the center, govern on the left. Or if you're the UCP, you campaign in the center and govern on the right. That's not the case, though. People were desperate for very significant reform in Alberta. They voted. Here's the thing. The NDP would accuse the UCP of having this hidden agenda, and the UCP said, no. This pretty moderate conservative platform is what we're going to do. And but a lot of people on the right said, well, I hope they have a secret agenda, because I want them to kick some ass. I want them to go in there, really cut some spending. And you'd be shocked by the number of people who believed that Jason Kenney was a secret separatist. People who thought that he's one of them, and when the right moment comes, the mask is going to drop and he's going to call a referendum. You'd be shocked how many people voted for him believing he would do that. The left often believed he would do that too. It turned out, actually, he's pretty much, at least on most things, he's pretty much doing what he said. He is a committed Federalist.
He is a Federalist. There's no question, yeah.
Yeah, he is. He's not, he's not like myself, where I'd like to be one, but I don't see the prospect of it really getting fixed. I'm willing to try, but I don't think it'll succeed. He is an unconditional Federalist. And, we'll just take the budget, for example. He came to power promising this to magically balance the budget without cutting spending and without raising taxes, because there'd be this economic super boom. Well, that economic super boom never came. It got worse when oil prices went down a bit. They're kind of back up now, but it got worse when COVID happened. Obviously, that's going to kill anyone's economy. But even before then, this boom was not materializing. So it was based on a lot of kind of flimsy promises based on very questionable facts and premises. And then you get into people expected, he's going to get elected. We're going to have a referendum on equalization, and then Jason Kenney's going to go to Ottawa, give Justin Trudeau a noogie on the carpet until he says uncle and changes things, and we're going to get a fair deal. It's going to be great. Nothing whatsoever has happened. There was a panel called, the panel, under, I think, pretty political direction, rejected most of the more significant soft sovereignty / firewall ideas. And even many of the ideas they put forward, Kenney has rejected or just not acted on. And then we get into the lockdowns. Originally, most of us were willing to give him the benefit of the doubt, as most people in most countries and jurisdictions were. We didn't know how bad it would be, so we kind of accepted these lockdowns. Some people are in the comments, I know we're going to say, I never accepted it. No, you probably did early on, when everybody believed that, when it was just coming out of Wuhan and this was thought to maybe be the next Black Death. You probably accepted it early on. Now, some people became more skeptical over time about the severity of this, about how helpful it was for lockdowns. And then the guy who's elected, who's supposed to be about, the campaign slogan was strong and free. Well, we're still not strong, and we are much less free than we were when Jason Kenney came to power. We're now throwing pastors in jails. We have cops beating up kids for playing hockey. We've got restaurant owners losing their livelihoods. This is not a free place right now, and we're making international headlines for it. It's quite something. So I think we've actually lost Nathan for a second. Oh, there, he's back.
Oh, I'm still here.
You just faded to black for a second. So I think it's just some voters in the center and center left are buying the NDP's message that, this guy is an evil, racist, homophobe, and he's cutting spending. He's this draconian conservative. The NDP has been fairly effective in chipping away a little bit there. But most of the support that Jason Kenney has lost has been very much on the right and in populist circles, sometimes, but not always. Those are the same things in Alberta. It's been people who are disappointed that he's not doing what he said he would, or in some cases where they believed he had a hidden agenda and he's not doing that. I actually don't think that's fair. I knew the guy did. I didn't think the guy had a hidden agenda. I thought the platform was okay. It was a moderate conservative platform, but it wasn't very radical, and he's not been radical. But in some respects, he's not doing what he said. No one would have predicted COVID, but at this point, his actions are his own, and that's why less than half of the people who voted UCP in the last election, 55%, say consistently in polls now that they'll vote for him again. It's now into the low and mid 20s. So they're facing absolute oblivion. And if you're not strong at home, it's hard to be strong abroad. When the government at home here does not have the support of its own people, it's very difficult to carry a big stick and get anything changed elsewhere. That said, I don't think, even if he had the support of people here at home, Ottawa's not going to change because we tell them to. They're going to be forced to change, or we have to do something else entirely. Those are really the only two options. I think the whole strategy of we're going to have a referendum on equalization and then go tell Justin Trudeau to change things, it was never going to work. There was a time where I believed it maybe had a chance. But as I've come to understand the federal dynamics of Canada better, there's just no way that that's ever going to result in anything. So I think a lot of people are just disappointed.
Absolutely. Well, I understand that you have to go, and we have our other guests ready to go on our end. I want to say thank you again, Derek, for being in my inaugural show and giving us such a great kind of view of how things are happening. But thank you so much.
My pleasure, Nathan. Next time, ask more questions. I'll talk too long if you don't ask questions and cut me off.
I'm happy to listen. But thank you for joining us, and you have a great rest of your day.
You too. Take care.
Absolutely. Well, we're gonna do this the old-fashioned way. I mean, there's fades, there's dissolves, but hey, this is live, and we're just gonna bring people in the old-fashioned way. It can just move forward. I think the biggest thing with how we're gonna have to talk about all of this is that, one, of course, we have Aaron Ekman here, former Secretary Treasurer of the BC Federation of Labor. It's an interesting kind of mix. I mean, this is the Western Standard. Obviously, the Western Standard has a rather right-wing view of a lot of things. But the other thing that is important here is that in BC, both the left and the right have to kind of learn to work together if they want to get a better deal out of Ottawa and if they want to get a better deal across the West. And so that's kind of what we're going to focus on here for the next hour. So we're going to move forward and discuss that. Aaron, welcome to the program.
Very excited to... I'm very excited about this show. I'm excited about this publication, and I'm happy to be a token lefty. I've even put my hair into a man bun here.
Perfect. You're wearing hemp and everything else.
I'm not wearing hemp, but that's a good idea. If you have me on again, that's what I'll do. But I caught the opening segment with Derek, and you know, as liberal or left wing or progressive as someone might call me, I found myself agreeing with an enormous number of points that both of you brought up. And again, I didn't get a chance to talk to Derek, but you know, as a lefty out here in British Columbia, just absolutely delighted to see the Western Standard fired up again, and it's just such an important position that I think they're taking, that they're advancing.
I think the thing is that when it comes to the two sides in any country, let alone ours in Canada, the issue is, how do we articulate to the other side something where we could find common cause? So a perfect example is even the question of religious liberty or the ability to have freedom of expression, right? So, I mean, throughout the lockdown and everything else, we've had, gatherings have been made illegal, which actually means that people who are organizing, like yourself or something, that suddenly becomes very difficult. But then specifically to what we're talking about today a little bit, when it comes to Western identity and sovereignty, what's the left-wing case for sovereignty? Why do we on the right always think we're just alone in this? We're surprised to hear there might be anybody to the left that's interested in this.
Well, it's a great question. And I think, the quick answer is that there isn't much of a left-wing case for sort of the sovereigntist position or the more independence position out here in the West. I think there is a progressive case, but I find myself having to make it quite often. But it's not too dissimilar from, I think, what we're hearing from more conservative or right-wing voices in the West. But from my perspective, it's more of it's a discussion like Derek had talked about reconceptualizing Confederation. My take on it, and you and I have had the benefit of being able to chat about this in the past in varying levels of detail. But I agree with a lot of folks on the conservative side of the spectrum that the West is not being given a fair deal within Confederation. Historically, I view Confederation as something that was quite important for British Columbia back when we made that decision to join in the late 1800s. But it was, as I've said before, it was we forget that over 50% of the population, at least the white population in British Columbia, when we made that decision, had American citizenship and had sort of Republican values and sympathies across the border. Even our second premier here, Morta Cosmos, who's quite famous for a number of different reasons. He initially was a citizen in California and had to change citizenship. So British Columbia really could have gone any way, and it really was at the time probably the best business decision that we could make, given that we had a number of commodities, et cetera, that had to be shipped across the country. And we were able to negotiate a deal with the federal government for them to build a railroad, which they didn't do right away. And in fact, a year after we joined, or a couple of years after we joined, we were already talking about pulling out again because we weren't getting the deal that we'd been promised. And it took that threat of pulling out of Confederation right at the very beginning to get the federal government to follow through with the promise they had made that brought us in. And so that's why I have a lot of time for arguments like the ones that have been made by Derek in the first half of the show, that even if you're not a sovereigntist or a separatist, full stop, you have to understand that what Quebec has done has worked very well for the people of Quebec.
Very well for them.
And it is absolutely a card that we should keep in our pocket. And you don't have to be a full-on separatist or a hater of the Federalist Project to take that position. And in fact, if we're not going to do that, who is? And so yeah, there might be some. There are political differences across the provincial boundary between Alberta and BC. I come from originally Terrace, British Columbia, logging town. Come from a logging family. Everybody worked in forestry, either driving trucks or they're out in the bush cutting trees. And to the person, they're all in Alberta now, with the exception of my very immediate family, who all went down south when the bottom sort of fell out of forestry here. And so I come from this family that's got these sympathies across the provincial border, and some of those tensions kind of play out around prior to COVID, or around the dinner table when we're discussing political politics or just politics. And my family members that have moved to Alberta, it's not to say that they weren't kind of conservative when they were in British Columbia, but they probably became a bit more conservative when they went to Alberta. And then me, I've spent my whole life here in British Columbia, and so we are products of our surroundings. And so I tend to be quite a bit more progressive than the rest of the folks in the family, but we do agree on these issues. And so that's why even people like me, I think, can really get behind a publication like the Western Standard, which I've always had a lot of respect for and its history. Was quite excited when I'd sort of read a couple of years ago that Derek was going to rekindle it, and I really like where you guys are going with this.
I think that maybe the way to kind of conceptualize it is that even if somebody likes the idea of Canada being Canada and Canada keeping the same borders, right? And I in many respects, I don't want the borders of Canada to change. I must admit that. But I also want those internal borders to make more sense, which might even mean, in a sense, like redividing the provinces. I think the provinces themselves might agree there's some lines here that don't really make sense, but that's a different part of that question. In the end, it comes about the people. It comes down to the people where they are, feeling that they have a stake in it. And I think that's the biggest thing, is like, we need to have a stake in this country. And I think that's where all of that Western alienation starts. So where is our stake? Every time we go to Ottawa, every time we talk to people that are in charge in the federal government, it seems like they just don't hear us. And it doesn't matter who we elect, because I'm on the right. We've been electing conservatives a long time here. How do we get from where we are to Ottawa actually listening to us?
Yeah, and again, like I've managed a number of campaigns for left-wing political parties and both federal elections and provincial elections, and I share your frustration. Most recently, in 2015, and then the most recent federal election, watching sort of this wave of red cover the eastern provinces, before they even open our ballot boxes out west here. And, we used to, Elections Canada used to delay the reporting of the results, but it's, so that we didn't have this feeling of futility watching sort of these Eastern votes just bowl us over. And to the point that, by the time we got to like Saskatchewan, it was, there were not enough votes left in the country to change the course. And so it did lead to this feeling of futility out west. It didn't matter whether you're on the left of the spectrum or the right of the spectrum. If you didn't want to see Liberals get reelected, it was frustrating, and it still is frustrating. And now in the age of the internet, you can't really delay the results anymore. So we see that stuff. But I'm like I said, I'm very, very excited that there is now an organ like the Western Standard that is having these conversations. And I think, British Columbia it's kind of a difficult place to have these discussions. I think it's not as, there isn't the wide basis of support that I think you see in Alberta around conversations, not just of separation, but of sovereignty and trying to create more independence for the West. And part of it is because we are a divided province politically. You guys talked in the opening segment about some of the political differences in Alberta. There, Derek described there being some radical environmentalists, et cetera, which of course we have here in British Columbia. But again, even within the environmental movement, there's sort of a right-left split as well, and that's interesting to see. But British Columbia is like one of the most eccentric jurisdictions, I think, in Canada, and sort of proudly so. Yeah, we're sort of like the Portland North. Like we like to keep it weird on a provincial level. But what comes with that is sort of a high degree of desire for autonomy, both personal and in terms of personal liberty and freedom. And I don't know whether that's like, there's a big difference between the folks I say the Lower Mainland, but I really mean like Vancouver and Victoria. The Lower Mainland isn't an accurate reflection, but there's a total divide, I think, in the understanding of what British Columbian culture is down in that area versus how the rest of us like the rest of the province, how we understand ourselves to be. And so you and I have had discussions about the vast political differences between the northeast of the province versus the northwest, even the West Coast. But it's not even that cut and dry. There's definitely political divides. But what I think is really exciting about this program is that for the first time in my lifetime, I think that I can remember, there's going to be talented and articulate commentators like yourself, for instance, that are going to provoke these debates on what it means to be a British Columbian within Confederation in the modern era. But more than that, how can we conceptualize how things might be different? And this is tough because people get really attached to this brand that has been created around Canada, which isn't that old. We just celebrated our 150th anniversary, which in the history of most countries in the world is a blip. It's just like, it's nothing. It doesn't even register. And so to me, it's always been I'm kind of with you guys in the sense that I'm not like eagerly flying the flag for separation necessarily. I'd like to see it work as well. Because there other than the economic arguments and the fairness arguments, there isn't really a compelling reason to leave, which is kind of how we got in this in the first place back in 71 or 72, where, we just sort of looked at the factors and said, well, this is the better deal. Let's try this for a while. But why wouldn't we conceptualize what the future might look like differently? Why can't we just have those conversations in a very civilized manner? Nobody's talking about, arms insurrection or trying to fight our way out or anything. It's let's just have the conversations about what Canada could look like. And if we're not talking about separation or total sovereignty, then maybe we could talk about rejigging the borders a little bit. It's always been interesting to me that, my friends in the Northeast, like Fort St. John, Peace River country in British Columbia, for instance, were far more culturally closer to Albertans than to the southwest of the province, for instance.
And if you do that plug here, because this is Mountain Standard Time, and they're on Mountain Standard Time. Go figure.
That's right.
There it is.
Even a different time zone, right? And so I know that the big challenge for Alberta in this conversation, of course, is trying to get product to Tidewater. That's the huge challenge. So how do you have this conversation about a Western identity and Western unity, et cetera, if you've got this province whose the majority of their economy, not all of it, but the majority of the economy is based on the export of a natural resource, and that export has to take place over a body of water, but they're barred on that western side by folks that are absolutely opposed to pulling that stuff out of the ground in any respect whatsoever. with really no no attention paid to what that would mean for the economy of British Columbia of Alberta in particular. But specifically, what it would mean for, like, if we shut down all that export, what it would mean for the jobs of working people there, and then what's the consequence of that? And so that's the frustration that plays out, and the tension, I think, that plays out in British Columbia as a microcosm, probably more so than Alberta. But it's tough to have those conversations about sovereignty or greater independence, greater autonomy, sort of along the state structure south of the border, without having those discussions about natural resources, et cetera.
I think that another aspect of that too is that we British Columbians have to remember just how privileged we are to have the access we have to cheap energy when it comes to hydro. This does not mean that we just need to roll over when it comes to issues around environment, or we want our protections to be observed. That's not the question. The question, though, is that at a deeper level, we need to acknowledge that part of the reason that we're not as worried about this whole getting oil to tidewater thing, apart from the whole environmental question, is that, quite frankly, like, we don't need to fire up fossil fuels and that sort of thing in British Columbia to the respect of just generating our general power, like the electrical power we have. And we have a huge amount of capacity. We can turn up the dams, we can turn down the dams. We are good to go. Whereas there are other parts of this country, particularly Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. Manitoba's got some decent hydro as well. But the point is that the hydro in the rest of the West is not the same thing that we have. We are very lucky, and other places have other things they need to make the means to do the things they want to do.
Yeah, and I mean, this is a discussion that makes me rather unpopular in sort of the leftist circles that I walk in. Is my huge support for public ownership of BC Hydro, but also the expansion of BC Hydro. British Columbia, one of my favorite premiers happens to be a Socred, quite a conservative fellow by the name of W.A.C. Bennett. Or if there's anybody from Alberta watching, they may or may not be familiar with him, but they'd certainly be familiar with the Socred tradition in Alberta, because it was the only place on earth where, it was the first place on earth that Socreds had formed government, even though it was, sort of imported from the UK, and actually implemented real social credit, which is very similar to a universal basic income. But what I've always said about BC Hydro is that British Columbia has got the potential, since W.A.C. Bennett was premier and negotiated the Columbia River Power Treaty with the U.S. British Columbia's always had the potential to be a pardon the pun, but a powerhouse, a literal powerhouse, where we can develop energy not just for consumption by British Columbians and our neighbors to the east, but also for industry and for export to the U.S. In a way that generates non-tax-based income for the public sector. It lessens the public sector's, public government, or the provincial government's reliance on taxation, and that's something that actually can be fixed legislatively. We have to ensure that BC Hydro isn't required to buy power from independent power producers from a price that is higher than what they can sell it for in the open market. Because what you're doing there is you're subsidizing, you're forcing taxpayers to subsidize independent power producers when we've got a fantastic public utility, which we don't have to worry about, paying ridiculous, like millions and millions of dollars to the highest level executives, and we can turn the revenue from that institution back into the public coffers and fund things like healthcare. Maybe we could have purchased some more vaccines, for instance, without having to rely on the federal government, right? So that's unpopular in left-wing circles, obviously. And in British Columbia, there's quite a strong lobby against the construction of a hydroelectric dam, which just boggles the mind, because it's the same people that will, fight like hell to stop Alberta from moving their product to Tidewater, because they think, because they're opposed to fossil fuel-based energy production and export of all kinds. Never mind the fact that they burned a fair bit of gas on their hot shower this morning, of natural gas. But they're also opposed to a much cleaner form of energy. And so, it just begs the question, well, what kind of energy are you in favor of? That's not a left or a right wing question. I come from what many would probably regard as an old school leftist tradition. Like, I'm a fan of like the CCF, Tommy Douglas, that kind of thing. All people who understood, in a manner that I think the left wing has forgotten, that the public should own these things and the public should benefit first from it. And these are essential infrastructure that, it's not that you should freeze the private sector out entirely, but it's when you've got infrastructure like that that's that important for the national or the provincial interest, then it's in the interest of taxpayers to have ownership and control over it. And so if it's messing up and not doing a good job, the public's got the ability to turf those folks out and put a new regime in where you don't necessarily have that same ability in a private model of that, like we saw in Texas, right, with the disaster that they had there. So they don't really have, hopefully some heads will roll over what happened down there. But the public doesn't have the direct ability by affecting which government is sort of in power to pull the bad, the incompetence out and replace it with competence again. And I know many folks, and probably many of your viewers, would argue vociferously that there's no such thing as competence in the public sector. And if that's true, we're in trouble. But the thing that I always try to say is, look, the one thing that is absolutely the same between private and public sector institutions or corporations or crown corporations is that they're both run by humans. And humans, it doesn't matter sort of which environment you work in, we're all prone to corruption. We're all prone to occasional bouts of incompetence. The important thing is structuring things in such a way that you can address that incompetence, which we're able to do once every 4 years with our politicians, and hopefully we can get the incompetence in Ottawa out. But I also like a system where you can have that same direct impact on the leadership of a crown corporation as well. I know a lot of people will disagree with me on that on the right, but I have a lot of disagreement on that on the left as well, just because they don't think these things should be built. The other side of it is it's very difficult for the private sector to build a mega project like a dam, for instance. You have to have taxpayer support for that kind of thing. The benefit of it is once it's done, we own it. It's ours. And unless it's sold off, nobody can take it from us. And that's something that I think when we're talking about British Columbia identity or Albertan identity and sort of the Western identity, we want to be very clear about which taxpayer assets are at our disposal. And we want to be very wary, I think, of letting those taxpayer assets go, because once they're gone, it's very difficult to get them back. And so that's sort of why I have the position I do on Site C. Very pro, but I want to keep it public so that we've got control over it.
I think that's actually a really interesting segue into the fact that what happens with the West is that actually a lot of the Western, except for BC, actually BC's borders came in intact into Confederation, but Alberta and Saskatchewan and Manitoba, they were created by federal statute. And so that's another aspect of what has to be discussed when it comes to this question of Western sovereignty, because the fact of the matter is that honestly, if a vote was held tomorrow, and let's say that it really was 51%, everybody decided they wanted to leave, one of the weird ways that it might all get stymied, just like the Brexit vote, is it might all get litigated in the courts, because the courts would have to start weighing into, well, what part of Western Canada are you allowed to take with you? British Columbia, it's pretty much a done deal. British Columbia entered with the borders it had. It can leave with the borders it had, though I'm sure that the Aboriginal sovereigntists themselves would have something to say about that. And that's why when my first column for the Standard, I talked about this. I said there was no way forward for Western sovereignty or and any kind of deeper independence from Ottawa without, of course, buy-in from the First Peoples of Canada. And I would say the same even for BC, despite the fact that at least, or in spite of the fact that they did have complete borders when they entered Confederation. But for the rest of the West, the question of borders is actually pretty serious, let alone who really owns what. And then finally, again, just back to the question of how do you administer such a place? What, we actually do get not I would say not a ton of benefits for the federal government on a lot of different counts, but there are a certain exchange. And then if the West all leaves together, they're all going to have to figure out who's going to be in charge of all of them, or are they all going to be a separate entity? And if that's the case, then is it any different than right now? Because then BC really could cut off Alberta, but now Alberta can't go to Ottawa to tell them BC to get BC on side. This is that difficulty with Western separation in general, but with Canadian Confederation in general, is that it's a very complicated idea. And how that is supposed to work between the provinces and between the various levels of government, I'm not exactly sure. But I think that, again, coming back to the question of how we would make allies out of our progressive political opponents on the other side of the spectrum, is that I think both of us can say, again, whether it's the stake in the country or the fact that Ottawa is just always so incompetently administering our homes and intervening in our lives for no good reason, I think progressives can argue that as well. Like, shouldn't the people who live here, and even if we're talking about progressive issues around whether we're talking about, poverty or, affordable living and that sort of thing, which I don't think should just be progressive issues. I think that should be right-wing issues too. But the point is that if we're going to talk about affordable living and people having a living wage and that sort of thing, like that there's an economy that provides that. I mean, I think that's the right-wing answer to it, right? Mm-hmm. That there would be economy to produce that. The thing is that there's got to be a way for both the right and the left in the West to agree that we should work towards something better, because what we're getting from Ottawa right now isn't working.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, my take on incompetence, I mean, I talk about Ottawa incompetence a lot, but they're not really incompetent. They just don't care about us as much as they care about themselves. That's the truth, right? People are inherently self-interested. And so we should understand that. I mean, we shouldn't hide from that reality. We should know that, when you're in a country this large geographically, I mean, it's vast. You're going to have regional preferences. And if your capital is the same distance from you as basically Japan is from us, things are going to be culturally quite different out there. And the decisions that they make every day are not necessarily going to put the interests of British Columbians or Albertans or Manitobans or Saskatchewanians first. And so it doesn't matter if you're left or right. That's something that we should understand. You asked me earlier about the progressive case for sovereignty or independence or separation of the West. And I would say that if there is one, it fundamentally involves the inclusion and hopefully the alliance with Indigenous peoples in British Columbia, many of whom I think, if we're actually polled on this question, would probably have a very similar opinion in terms of their own feelings of experience within Confederation. Probably not from their perspective very positive. And so, I think the point of unity is to have those discussions and to realize that even though we might have different opinions about what's wrong with Confederation, we can at least agree that there's something wrong with Confederation and it's not serving all of our interests. And then, of course, there's the political dynamics of British Columbia, which, and I'm just pulling this out of the air because I don't have any stats, but I would venture a guess that there's probably more concern amongst a majority of British Columbian voters about the opinions of Indigenous people in regards to Confederation than maybe the electorate in Alberta has. I don't know that for sure, but I know that Indigenous opposition to different issues, especially environmental issues in British Columbia, are a huge political sort of yardstick, especially for progressives. So many of them sort of take their lead from where Indigenous voices go on these issues. So if you get into a situation where a majority of Indigenous organizations and leaders and speakers are starting to talk about reconceptualizing Confederation in alliance with people like us that are also having these discussions, I think it makes it very difficult for progressives in British Columbia to really argue against that. It's very difficult, especially for those that have been touting, reconciliation and expanded treaty rights, et cetera, for the last 20 years, to now turn around and say, well, we don't want to go that far, when Indigenous people are saying, well, maybe we should consider this. So that's sort of I think that's the piece that, I'd like to see discussed, because so far, and this is just from my observance, it's not necessarily reality, but from what I've observed, the conversations around sovereignty and independence and strengthening the West are happening in sort of segregated groups, right? I don't see, I see these conversations taking place within Indigenous communities, but not with the same sharpness and sort of clarity or focus that's happening in non-Indigenous communities. But I think those conversations have to be merged. And why wouldn't they? I mean, that's if you're talking about reconceptualizing a nation, you have to talk to everybody that's in it and try to build that base of support amongst the majority, irrespective of whether you agree with them or not on every other issue. That's partially why you and I get along so well, is because we find, and part of the reason why, why I can have a lot of respect and excitement for an organ like the Western Standard, even though I'm from the progressive end of the spectrum politically, because these are issues that I think transcend, the political divide. And so it's just so exciting.
I think that's actually, it's an interesting segue right there. And again, that's one of the things that I'm appreciative of for both you coming on in this inaugural show, but also for the conversations we've had about this over the years, and hopefully continue to have for much longer, to the success of them, to be clear, to the success. The thing that is interesting about British Columbia, maybe this is kind of harder for particularly Albertans and maybe all other prairie folk to kind of conceptualize about a BC, is that, speaking of the sovereignty question, like this is exactly what happened with the Wet'suwet'en kind of thing. Wet'suwet'en, sorry, I guess it's kind of the right way to accent it. And what happened west of here? I mean, we're broadcasting you from BC's northern capital, and
which is Prince George for those.
Yeah, Prince George, to be clear.
Friends, yeah.
And so the just west of us here, out towards the coast and the in between there, out west of Smithers, there was, of course, the protest that happened. But this entirely has been swept under the rug now because, of course, we have had COVID for so long. We forgot that anything else happened before COVID. But right in 2020, at the beginning of 2020, of course, there was this huge protest. Obviously, there was all sorts of organization that went into it and agitation throughout the country. Obviously, there were things done to the rail lines and everything else. And we're not going to either excuse that or condone that or whatever's going on. Like, things happened is the point. And the interesting thing is, like, again, maybe in the rest of the West, that would have been more of even a non-Indigenous versus Indigenous sort of argument, right? So the First Nations on one side and I don't like to say colonizers, but that's what's used nowadays. On the other, that's not how it is in BC. To a point, there was division within the First Nation itself.
Sure,
like that's how hyper sovereigntist is British Columbia. There's division within our divisions, right? Like
that's BC in a nutshell, yeah.
Right? Like, I mean, and I think this is the thing that's hard for the rest of Western Canada maybe to understand is that, like, BC is a bunch of river valleys, okay? Like, it's a bunch of little, right, fjords and all sorts of other things, right? And then it's river valleys, and there's like one or two little prairies that are actually plateaus, so they're surrounded by mountains. They're not really accessible. So the thing is that, like, for the rest of the West, like, it needs to be understood that while I've been out to Churchill, I've been to Manitoba, like, I understand not all the geography is the same. I get that, but there are places in BC you really can't walk to. Like, you need or it's going to be a really long trip. It's not the same kind of voyageur sort of stuff you could do in yesteryear and days of yore in the prairies and follow a river for 10,000 kilometers and get somewhere. That's not how it works in BC. And so in British Columbia, even our divisions have divisions.
Yes,
even
right.
Our sovereigntists are sovereigntists against each other. And so I think that maybe that's exactly where that conversation needs to start. And I'm really excited. I hope people are commenting, suggesting guests. I hope people are also giving us ideas of who should come on the show and that sort of thing, because I think what's really important, I think it's super important for people to just network on this issue, of how are we going to kind of clarify what it means to be a Western Canadian, particularly a British Columbian in Western Canada, and then what is the best way forward throughout all the West, but also especially for British Columbia, again, because it does get this radical, the divide, right? This is why I have Aaron on here for our first show, is to make clear from day one that we are here to be an open conversation with our political opposites. For a lot of people who are, fans of Standard, like, we're more populist and right wing, we have to be in partnership in the sense that we are not going to get out of Confederation alone, or even if we want to make Confederation better, we aren't going to be able to do that alone. That's not a one-man project.
Argument has to be expanded, yeah. And we saw Johnny Blum's question. Sorry if I said your name wrong, Johnny, but asked the question, what type of energy would we like to see? And it relates. That question's a perfect callback to your point on the Wet'suwet'en incident that happened here earlier. And so, this was an extremely divisive issue in British Columbia. It really gets to this question of what kind of energy do we want to see. So that was over the expansion of the Coastal Link gas line through Wet'suwet'en territory. And just to sort of break it down for folks that may not have paid close attention to that.
It feels like a million years ago because of COVID.
Yeah. So this played out, I think, in January or February of last year, right? And so essentially what happened was, the provincial government had, the project, of course, predates the NDP government in BC. It was a BC Liberal, and it was initiated under the BC Liberal government. The BC NDP didn't really have a different take on the project, and had continued negotiation with the different band councils in the area, which are referred to usually in Indigenous circles as Indian Act band councils. So they were band councils that were created by the Indian Act. And generally, there's a dispute between them and many of the hereditary chiefs over sort of, not necessarily a dispute, but maybe a debate over whether the jurisdiction of the band councils extends beyond the reserve over the traditional territory, or whether the hereditary chiefs maintain that level of authority. And then, of course, there's political divisions even within the chief circles, because some of them are hereditary, not all are hereditary, some are elected, et cetera. In any case, I had a rather nuanced position on it, which drew ire, I think, probably again from the left and the right. So I was actually in favor of the Coastal GasLink pipeline coming through. And it's not because I think, we should be solely reliant on fossil fuel based energy, especially in a province where we've got, a comparatively high level of hydroelectric power. But you can't do everything with electricity. I mean, you still have to, you got to move gas around. And so despite being in favor of that project, as many of the Indigenous folks on the band councils were, as they had articulated to the provincial government during negotiations, leaving the provincial government in the position of thinking that everybody's basically in favor of this, then a group of activists within the Wet'suwet'en Nation who were not really on the band council, but were more aligned with there were some hereditary chiefs there, et cetera. They set up blockades to try to stop it. And the reason why I supported their right to do that was not because I was opposed to the gas line coming through. I was opposed to the federal government being able to basically send in the RCMP into sovereign territory, whether you consider the Wet'suwet'en Nation to be sovereign or whether you consider British Columbia to be sovereign. I didn't like the idea of the RCMP coming in to enforce basically, a corporate expansion into sovereign territory, even though I was in favor of that happening. And that's sort of, I think, the nuanced position that we those kind of nuanced positions are what are important if we're going to bring people on board with this idea that, it's possible for us to have more sovereignty and more say over what happens in our own borders. It's similar to the question on interprovincial travel during COVID between BC and Alberta. I had to step up. I'm not sure if you got into this in the opening segment, but there was a lot of British Columbians are calling for a total ban. I mean, people in my family are like who sort of, they're caught in this tension between BC and Alberta. The ones that are still in BC, they want that border shut right down, right? And I don't know
down the Rockies.
And I don't know if it's because they're worried about COVID or they just don't want the in-laws visiting as often, right? But whatever, and you get on Twitter and that's all you see on there is people calling for more restrictions on our freedom and more lockdowns and all this kind of stuff. And people like me, and I think people like you at the time were saying, well, hang on a second. Because let me back up. When this question was posed to Premier Horgan in BC, his position was, well, I don't think we really can shut down the border anyway. And we were wondering whether he was referring to a logistical argument or whether he was referring to making a constitutional argument, which are two different things. So, and when he was asked to clarify it, he sort of fell back to the logistical argument, saying, well, it's difficult. It's logistically difficult or impossible to shut down all the entry points between BC and Alberta, which is just hogwash.
I mean, there's like 4.
Yeah, it's really not that hard if we wanted to do it. But the point is, there was no evidence that there was this huge influx of COVID infections crossing the border from Alberta.
No.
The COVID infections would take place pretty much where you think they would. They'd spark in the old age homes and in places where people are gathering and that kind of thing. So it wasn't an evidence-based call anyway. People, I think they just see Albertan license plates driving around. They don't like it. And so if they come up with some excuse to try to shut that down, but it's just stupid. I mean, they're coming here, they're spending money, and there are sisters and brothers, just over the provincial border. Like they're us. So I don't know what that was all about, but I was rather concerned for a moment that our premier would take the position that possibly that constitutionally we can't shut the border down. You damn rights we can. And if the federal government disagrees, well, let's just do it anyway. I mean,
it's going to take 50 years to litigate the court case, and by then everyone's going to have forgotten that it happened.
That's right. And so if they tell us, no, you can't do that anymore, okay, well, thanks. We'll remember that until we do it again. But the point I want to make is you can take that position about having the sovereignty over your own provincial border without advocating to actually shut things down between BC and Alberta, which we're definitely agreed would just be stupid. And so that's another issue where it's just a good example of this question of sort of provincial versus federal sovereignty. And the points that you and Derek made in the opening segment were absolutely spot on. Most of the political parties out west, whether they're conservative or progressive, and the NDP is no exception in British Columbia in particular, they're all staunchly federalist parties. So you're never going to get any discussion of this with an NDP government in British Columbia. I mean, the big story at the beginning of the NDP elevation back in 2017 was sort of this burgeoning bromance between Horgan and Trudeau, which I think a lot of people,
hard to watch.
Well, for people like me, it was sickening. Actually, it's just like, oh God, really? Like, why don't we just elect federal liberals then? Which thankfully we don't really have in British Columbia. But the consequence of that, of course, is if federal liberals end up sort of infesting there's an infestation in the BC NDP, and then there's also, some of them end up in the more conservative aligned parties. Certainly there's lots in the BC Liberal Party. And that's a problem. I mean, I think this question needs to be driven right through all of those parties. Where do you stand on these issues of provincial independence vis-a-vis the federal government? How willing are you to just contract out all of our sovereignty, provincial sovereignty and authority to Ottawa, which is, like I said, not that much farther away from us than Japan, And
it doesn't, and it certainly doesn't. It doesn't seem that way from the perspective, at least, of international trade and internal trade in Canada. I think something else that kind of needs to be noted here. It's actually being brought up by one of our commenters here. Cindy is saying that you should have them on your show, the chiefs that represent their territories. And I think that is part of it. It's like we have to find the stakeholders. I mean, this is kind of classic Canadiana, right? Like, so right from the beginning of Confederation, right, we had, of course, somebody had to represent the French speaking as well as the Roman Catholic religion, right, that was found in New France, now, then Quebec or, Lower Canada. And then, of course, what was going on in Ontario, right, which was very strongly, it's very orange, very Protestant, very proud to not be Catholic, and then how to figure that negotiation out. Though, of course, there were minorities in both places. Then there was the absentee landlord issues in the Maritimes, because people kind of colonized the Maritimes the way they'd colonized Wales, right? Or at least in the sense that the power being projected by the majority or by those in power over the people there was that, yeah, no, you can just be my serfs. And it's like, well, this is the new world. Like, can't we be free and have our liberty and blah, blah, blah. So, I mean, like, this has always been kind of the thing. Like, when it comes to Canadian issues, we have to find of course, just the stakeholders, right? We have to find the stakeholders, the people who can represent their particular population, and then move forward. But again, this is actually a great place to mention something else that's been brought up between us before, which is, I think, again, maybe perhaps it's hard for people throughout the rest of Western Canada to understand just how diverse BC is. And that's diversity before we had more immigration. Okay? And I'm not saying I'm against immigration or anything. That's fine. But I mean that, like, we have diversity, of course, since newer immigration, for sure, and the post-war boom and everything else that's happened in BC. But there's a huge amount of diversity here, too, because it goes all the way right back to even our inception as a province. There's really like a firewall between church and state, because of how paranoid the founders of our province were when it came to questions around, church schools versus provincial schools and public schools. This is not an old or a new problem. This is an old problem in British Columbia, and the diversity of those stakeholders is a lot. So the idea that our 150th is coming down the pipe here in BC. Obviously, it's COVID, so that's probably not going to help anything. But at our 150th, how would we even celebrate BC properly? It's pretty hard. Like, you got so many different people that would have to represent their particular kind of background and what they bring to BC, and then have them come together. And I just, I come from, my mother is a Mennonite and through Vanderhoof, and then of course Swift Current stock. So, Low German and everything else coming out of Saskatchewan. Of course, like Mennonite, big population in the prairies. But this is the thing, in a way, like, I understand that belonging better than I understand it as it is out here in BC, because it's kind of a very important population right where she's from, but it's rather diverse. They're not necessarily all connected in BC, even though they do share a similar faith and, of course, an ethnicity and the food and the family background, the traditions. Like this, that's a perfect example. The same thing to the point of the two Aboriginal groups being set up against each other on the question of the pipeline. There's just a lot of diversity in BC. And so the question of sovereignty or independence or getting more from Ottawa, it's so easy to conquer and divide in BC. It's kind of the point I'd make there.
That's a good point. I really like this point that we put up. Western Canada had BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. Western Canadian license plates only. People wouldn't know which province you're from, and discrimination would be more difficult. It's actually a great idea. The challenge, of course, is that in BC we have there's a public monopoly on auto insurance.
That's right.
Through ICBC, which I'm very in favor of, and you're probably not in favor of. But that would, we'd have to reconcile between the provinces sort of who was issuing the plates, and whether it was done through the evil public monopoly or left to the private sector.
Or you could just draw your own.
Yeah.
So like straight up anarchy. You just make your own, get your own little piece of tin, and then like get your little, you pound in your numbers from behind it.
But I love that people are thinking like this, because the challenge I think we have before us is showing this kind of, on the left we call it solidarity, but showing this unity of purpose and identity despite our diversity, between the provinces, because if we don't engender that kind of unity between the four Western provinces, Ottawa just continues to roll over us. And this is what the Western Standard, of course, has been identifying for decades through its various iterations. And I'm really happy to see that focus hasn't shifted in this newest iteration. But that's the challenge. And as you know, we talk a lot about diversity on this show. And even though I'm a progressive, I tend to agree with conservatives on this question of whether diversity is a strength or not. I don't think it's a strength. It doesn't mean that diversity is a bad thing, but it's a challenge. You don't have to think too hard about this to understand that it's a challenge. Of course, it's a challenge when you have a whole number of people that have very different backgrounds and different politics and different views of the world and how the world works. Trying to create this kind of unity of identity and culture in such a young country is very difficult, but it's a task that we have to undertake. In fact, that's what the Canadian project was.
Absolutely, it was.
And now we fly the slogans of how diversity is a strength, which is actually, it's disingenuous and doesn't help us. It doesn't help any of us to try to pull everybody together, because it totally ignores the challenges that are posed by diversity, and sort of leaves us off the hook in trying to surmount those challenges and build that common unity and political purpose. I think there's an appetite for it across all cultural divides within, especially the West, but certainly across Canada. You talk to anybody, and I think they generally want to see more unity and more agreement, less fighting, and sort of less
and a better country.
And a better country, absolutely. People have different ideas of what that looks like, but this is what a lot of people on the left who are really talking about trying to ban everybody and all this cancel culture stuff. And you get on Twitter, you say the wrong thing, and next thing you know, you lost your job and everything. I mean, all that does is suppress all of that discussion. And so it's not like, the people that they're banning, it's not like their opinions suddenly change or go away, and that the Twitterati have won. They still exist. It's just that they become further segmented, and it makes diversity even more difficult, because people get not just diverse, but separated and isolated, where the strength of not just the Western tradition, I don't mean Western tradition in the provincial sense, but Western tradition in the academic sense, in the global sense. The strength of it is that it's built on this idea that ideas should rub up against each other, create friction, and the result of that is some greater unity and a merging of those ideas.
And a better idea.
And a better understanding amongst people who don't see the world the same way, so that you can come to some common understanding and consensus. I mean, I generally hate the word consensus, but it's sort of apt in this.
I think that this is exactly it. Again, in this inaugural show, this is one of the reasons why we're doing what we're doing here. It's important. It's not just a symbol. It's a living thing, an incarnational thing, if you want to use certain Christian language. The idea is that, again, like, we are so siloed off from each other, and I think that's how Ottawa kind of continues to keep us under its thumb. And the Laurentian consensus continues to keep Canada under just a terrible kind of tyranny. Like, you don't have to get far from. It's not like it's just Ontario's fault. I like calling Ontario unterrible just to be that guy. But the truth is that right in the middle of Ontario, right, like right as soon as you get away from the very small strip of land between Toronto and then, of course, using Lower Canada and Quebec all the way out to Gaspé, that very small strip of land, as soon as you get away from that stuff, Ontario and Quebec, like rural Ontarians and Quebecers, even middle town, right, or larger towns but not in the Beltway, right, those people don't agree with what goes on in Toronto and in Quebec City and in Montreal. They don't agree with that. And they want something different. So I think all Canadians, around Canada that are not just in the little Beltway, are capable of finding agreement and moving forward as a country and getting somewhere. Of course, we focus here on Western Canada, but to your point as well, like, we're so siloed off sometimes that as soon as we hear an opposite idea, we immediately attack. We can see this all over Twitter nowadays. We can see it in cancel culture. That's something that I think it needs to be stated from the beginning here as well. We have no tolerance for cancel culture around here. We're going to be talking to people all across the spectrum on the show. We are here to hear real ideas from real people. We're not here to promote hate. Like, duh, that's obvious.
Quite the opposite.
But we are here to talk to people who might have some very challenging and controversial things to say. Well, amen. We need some new ideas, because the ideas we're working with right now are throwing people out of their houses. There's not enough work. The jobs aren't paying. And what we've done with COVID and how that's gone, that's not worked out well for us. So if we're going to go somewhere then we need to hear real ideas from different people. And it might sound strange at first, but we need to have some discussions. And as long as everybody can play within the rules and be polite, there's no reason for there to be any calls for cancellation here. I don't have any time for that. I don't think you have any time for that.
Well, no, I don't. And because you can't, like I said earlier, you cancel somebody, they don't disappear.
Mm-hmm.
They're still a voter.
No, exactly.
So if you're trying to build some kind of a political coalition where people are reconceptualizing what their own identity is and what it means for the future, you got to try to build as many people into, pull as many people into that discussion as possible, because you got to build that coalition. But it doesn't mean that you can't have significant disagreements with folks. And certainly as you start to have these discussions, as I've observed over the last probably decade or so, that I've been exploring the idea of reconceptualizing confederation, is that people get really, really emotional about this. There are people that are really, really attached to the Canadian brand, which, I get it. I understand it. People like to be proud of their country. I'm proud of my country. I'm not proud of who leads it, but that's not a reflection of the whole country. And it's certainly not a reflection of sort of the diversity from the center out west. But you have to, you have to have those discussions within the province to be able to pull everybody together. But you have to do so knowing that people are going to get really emotional about it. And so this is I think the challenge for folks is, and I've seen it's been interesting to watch people that are having these discussions in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, et cetera, how they respond to sort of the reaction you get back from federalists, for lack of a better term. And it's interesting because the reaction can be quite strong. I think the response from those of us who want to have these discussions needs to be tempered, civil, and articulate, because again, we don't want to fight our way out. We don't even necessarily want out. We just want to articulate what the future is, what our own needs are, and we also want to demonstrate. Let's be frank. I think the project before us is for the 4 Western provinces to be able to demonstrate definitively to Ottawa in a way that can't be denied by them, that we can pull our stuff together, and we can work in unison, and we can do so for Western interests, to the point where we can demonstrate that, look, we really can do this on our own if things don't get better.
And yeah, maybe they'd finally start paying attention.
Well, you don't have to fight with people to demonstrate that. You just do it. Mm-hmm. And so that's why building those linkages between the provinces is so important. Building the economic linkages between the provinces is important. It means that British Columbia, and I know this enrages so many of my environmentalist friends when I say this stuff, but British Columbia has to understand that Alberta needs to get its product to Tidewater, and we have to be partners in that. It doesn't mean that we don't share in the benefit of it. Absolutely, we should share in the benefit of it. I think the best way, I think pipelines should all be owned by BC Hydro that go through BC, and BC Hydro should be expanded to be a provincial energy crown corp, so that we've got control over the infrastructure in this province that is most vital to our provincial interests. And that if there's revenue that's derived from it, if there's wealth that's derived from it, which of course there is, it's going to us first. It's not going to people out of province, for instance, either through the way corporations siphon money out of the province or not. It's not to say that I want to freeze the private sector out. One of the functions of a crown corporation is also to contract in private sector contractors to do the work. But the ultimate revenue, the sale of the energy, the transport, the wealth that's generated, that's ours, man. And that's my point. And I think the reason why people on the left get so angry when I say that is because you just can't say, look, I think we actually should build pipelines.
Now, that's another one of your opinions that's probably going to get you in trouble on both sides, because on the other side, it sounds, on the right side, all I can hear is, it's not even, I'm not an Albertan, but I could hear it from a chorus somewhere in the back, that sounds like the National Energy Program again.
Yes, except we're running it. Right?
Okay, there you go.
Yeah, we'll call it the Western Energy Project.
Perhaps one thing to assuage any of the anger that might be stemming from our brothers and sisters on the other side of the mountains is that it should be noted that, of course, that was also administered from Ottawa, and that's why it didn't work. And maybe the other way to look at it too is that when the oil crash came, and I mourned the oil crash. I was right in the middle of getting my welding when the oil crash came. So obviously competing with guys who had their A tickets and 10 years of experience for a job that paid less than $20 an hour after oil crash was not working for me. So I got to suffer through that milieu as well. But the point is that maybe another way of looking at it is that whatever was going right for Alberta before everything went sideways in 2014. I mean, did those private corps show up after, things went sideways? That's a serious question. And so whether we have to call it the banal and very evil name we all know, the National Energy Program, or a provincial energy program, the BC Energy Program, the thing is that whatever was happening after peak oil, I think that Albertans really been left behind. And I think they've been let down by their own people on this, or people out of province people, international corporations that have kind of let them down. And that needs to change. So we need to find a way to make things more equitable on all these questions, whether we're talking about trees or oil or gas or hydro. There needs to be a way forward that definitely keeps that stake in our country, in our province, in our neighborhood, and the wealth from it is generated and brought back home. That's not a question. How we do that is a debate for a different time. We had another Facebook
this one by
come up here.
Pamela here.
Yeah,
it's good point. And it's certainly like people perceive it to be that way. And you're talking sort of about the North Coast area in British Columbia, so Prince Rupert, Kitimat, that kind of thing. I would disagree with you, Pamela, respectfully, in the sense that yes, there's a high concentration. You're absolutely right. There's a high concentration of environmentalists in that part of our province who are very vocal and concerned about moving energy products around. But you've had a conversation very recently with a fellow named Ellis Ross, who is, if folks aren't familiar with him, he's a member of the BC Liberal Caucus, which is currently the opposition party in British Columbia. But it's also sort of the with the exception of the BC Conservative Party, which holds no seats. That's sort of the home for conservatives in BC.
Federal conservatives.
Yeah, Ellis Ross is a former Haisla Nation chief, so an Indigenous man. He's actually running for the leadership of the BC Liberal Party, and he's from the North Coast, which is where the Haisla Nation is, and
former chief counselor for that.
Yeah, and very pro development, very and pro pipeline, and definitely understands sort of how our economy works. He recognizes that the majority of jobs in BC are not necessarily resource-based jobs. They are, in fact, like numerically, most jobs are in the service sector. But he understands, as far too few people do in this province, that those service sector jobs depend on the resource sector jobs. Like nobody's got any money to spend at the grocery store or a restaurant if those resource jobs don't exist. And we've seen this play out multiple times in British Columbia. Like Mackenzie is a great example, a real forestry town. And when the bottom sort of fell out of forestry in this province, we're going back now 15 years or so. A number of those jobs departed. A lot of the mills, like we had record mills shut down.
It was like a ghost town.
And to this day, I think they have. It's very difficult. The same thing happened to McBride. I think McBride's down to about 800 people now in the Robson Valley, and same kind of thing. And so it's devastating to those communities, and that's what happens when you lose the resource base. There's this misconception. I think you're absolutely correct. Not just on the North Coast amongst those activists, but it's the predominant view in Vancouver and in Victoria that we can sustain ourselves on these service sector jobs. It's as if it's this, for the
coffee will make itself, man.
Yeah, for the philosophers amongst you, it's like they believe there's just turtles all the way down. There's no foundation to any of it. It doesn't matter. And so you pose this question to these folks. Well, okay, if that's true, then Vancouver should be able to exist as a city-state. All unto itself, and just
rooftop gardens.
Yeah, and the economy will just keep humming along based on the restaurant industry. It's not to denigrate the restaurant industry; it's very important, and they're hurting right now, as bad or worse as anybody. But even the folks that I'm a former server for years when I was in college myself. I've slung drinks across the bar and subsisted on that industry for a number of years. But I understood, as I think most people in that industry understand. They understand who's coming in to buy the service, and they understand where their money comes from, especially if they're in a smaller community. And it is frustrating to see in the larger cities like Vancouver, Victoria, et cetera, they've forgotten that argument. They've forgotten the foundation of the economy. In the North Coast, which you've referenced, Pamela, I think the debates definitely play out. But there is a strong, like my uncle, for instance, used to work for BC Ferries and sort of works on the side with the spill cleanup crew. And a number of folks there, sort of in the same milieu, very pro-development. Kitimat, that's a pro-development town. There's environmentalist voices there for sure. So it's not quite as cut and dry. There's some hope that, if we were talking about a more independent future, that there you can be assured that there's people that agree with you that that our friends to the east in Alberta need some assistance in getting their product to Tidewater. And again, I mean, the conversation we haven't really had yet is like, what's the end goal here? Because it doesn't matter how supportive you are of fossil fuel energy based industries, or how long you think that those resources are going to last. They are actually finite. I mean, we may not see the end of it for generations, but they are finite. And so when something is finite and the supply starts to go down, the cost goes up. And even if that doesn't happen right away, there's other global factors that can drive the cost up. If Saudi Arabia or Russia start to flood the market again, the price can go down so low that it's just too expensive to pull it out of the ground in Alberta. It's not economical. And so we do, and this is what I think the left doesn't give any credit to the right about, is that there is an understanding amongst the pro-development forces that are mainly represented politically on the right end of the spectrum. There's an understanding there that we do have to transition at some point. We have to start working on transitions. And so on the left, you get these calls in the most radical sectors of just shutting it down now because there's a climate crisis and we're all going to die if we don't do this like within the next 12 minutes, right? Which is just a ludicrous argument. It doesn't matter it doesn't matter how much I agree with some of these folks on other issues. But what they refuse to see or to agree to or even discuss is how bad is it for civilization in our communities if you shut everything down right now. I mean, like, it's far worse than I think having to live through a hurricane or whatever is going to come from climate change. I mean, that stuff's bad and it's dangerous, but you can't downplay the economic. We're seeing this with COVID as well. I mean, this is the grand debate between lockdown versus economic sustainability, or health safety versus economic sustainability, and you just cannot take one position over the other. You have to recognize that lockdowns have a significant negative impact on our economy, and people suffer for that, and will suffer for generations if we don't take it into account. And we're seeing that. So we have to have this conversation about what that transition looks like, but it can't involve just turning the tap off. In fact, I would argue, and this is why I'm so in favor of sort of the public approach to utilities, through like a crown corporation on power, is that, it's like a corporation is not going to set aside some of the wealth that's derived from that extraction to try to fund public solar power plants in the same jurisdiction. They're not going to. It's not that they don't do that because they're evil. They're just not incentivized to do it. Their purpose is to make a profit. I mean, that's what the purpose of a corporation is. I don't say that in a negative way. That's literally why they're there. If they don't do that, people are out of jobs. I mean, that's how it works. Where if you do it under the public model, like BC Hydro, for instance, you can make decisions to siphon off some of that wealth and put it over into expansionary industries to try to prepare for a transition, or to provide a buffer or a fallback if we have a huge commodity spike somehow that is actually sparked for reasons beyond our control because of international factors. And so, having that sort of nuanced conversation it can be difficult in British Columbia. I don't think it's as difficult in Alberta. Although, obviously people like Derek will tell us that, no, we have those debates too. And he's absolutely correct. In British Columbia, I would say it's even more divided, and the pro-development forces and advocates have a more difficult time in British Columbia having that conversation, because there is this onslaught that's ever present of people that just, they won't even talk to you if you entertain any continuation of fossil fuel based industry or energy production.
And I think that the biggest thing for me is it's not even a question of like pointing out hypocrisy or whatever else. It's the single biggest thing for me is that it's not just the transitional thing, right? Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, right? Like we can either live in a more human world or we can live in a more inhuman one. I would choose the human one. But the flip side of the equation in my mind is that the fact of the matter is, even if we were to try to get to the ultimate green stuff they talk about, wind farms and tidal stuff, because even hydro for a lot of these environmental people is not, that's not good enough. It's still too much. It's too destructive to the environment, that sort of thing. And indeed, it does have destructive capabilities in the environment. I'm not acknowledging that, but again, if we're going to try and put things on the level or get a hierarchy of what is worse and what is better, that I think hydro is pretty high up there for a better kind of use of energy. But nonetheless, the point is that we can't just leave people behind. I think that's the biggest thing. And indeed, that's again the Western alienation thing all wrapped up in one little phrase, right? People feel left behind. They feel like Ottawa's just doing whatever it wants and it doesn't care what they do. And coming back to this issue, these debates that we need to have about how we're going to move forward into a brighter future, right? And perhaps a greener future, whatever that means. that transition has to be extremely well managed, and we can't be leaving people behind. And to the COVID point as well, there's that, I think it's in, what is it, The Big Short or whatever, there's that line, it's like, you realize that every single point of unemployment is literally 10,000 people killing themselves, right? Like, I mean, that's the United States numbers and whatever, right? But
there's a social cost. Yeah,
there's a social cost to what has happened. And I think, I believe the virus exists. There's no argument here that COVID-19 is or isn't real. It is real. We know it's real. The issue, though, is that our reaction to it, I really do believe that when we analyze the numbers, whenever we finally get out of this whole pandemic mentality, we finally move on. I think when we analyze the numbers, we're going to find that our prescriptions to COVID and using the lockdowns and stuff actually cost, I think that will have ended up costing more lives than COVID took. I really believe that.
Yeah. I really like this comment by John Frank here. Let's put it up on the screen. I know that there are a lot of shady things happening in northern BC, and that the views of the NDP is different to the Conservative side. If we turn into a Western country, do you think that the border should leave or stay so that we can think of one as the same or as now? I mean, it's interesting, right? Like this conversation about borders as we get into this conceptualization, those are the most exciting conversations to me, right? And I mean, the interesting piece, I think the entry point in having this discussion with folks in the Lower Mainland or Vancouver, Victoria proper, is to have these discussions about the Cascadian tradition. Because there has always, from my perspective, I think going back even to our parents' generation, sort of this nascent trend of people who have always been inspired by this idea of trying to create a national boundary around the Cascadian biosphere. And of course, that includes, that would have to include the participation of Oregon and Washington, and some people include maybe bits of Northern California, et cetera. But I think, I mean, that's a fascinating conversation to have from a geographic sort of a biosphere perspective. It makes a lot of sense. But it cuts out, I mean, I have a map of Cascadia on my wall at home, which is quite detailed, that I picked up last time I was in Portland before all the lockdown. And, the first thing I noticed, of course, is that in most conceptualizations of what this looks like, it sort of cuts out everything northeast of Prince George. Right? So we're actually not in it, and so, but this is interesting to talk about because, if you try to have this conversation with a lot of Vancouverites, maybe people in Victoria, on the progressive side of things, which there are many down there, they usually, they don't really want to talk about that unless you frame it in terms of like the traditional cascading boundaries. So what does that mean for the rest of British Columbia? Say, if we're just to pretend that like there was actually this movement and it was, there was a potentiality for Portland and Seattle to lead their states out of the federal union in the U.S. Then that sort of opens the door in my mind to this greater unity between Alberta and the northeast of British Columbia, extending right through to the northwest coast of British Columbia, just in that little space between sort of the top of the Cascadian biosphere and Alaska. So that provides the corridor that's needed for Alberta to get the product of Tidewater, but also provides sort of that political rationale and conceptualization of the Cascadian biosphere for the Lower Mainland, so to speak. Now, I've oversimplified things, but the question was asked, like, what do the boundaries look like? Well, those are the kind of interesting things that I think we got to start drawing out on napkins to take a look at to spark these kind of conversations. Because evidenced by Frank's question here, people are thinking about this. Like, what would it look like? Well, this is the perfect place to talk about it.
Well, we're coming to the end of our show here, so maybe we should do some closing statements here, or maybe some closing questions, some summing up and concluding. I think, again, just from the start, number one, thank you for joining us, and thank you for supporting the Western Standard. It's extremely important that we have these conversations and that we continue to grow this movement that would see the West either get a fair deal from Ottawa or get away from Ottawa and do what's right for the people who live here, regardless of race, class, creed, color, and background. But further to that, I mean, as a kind of closing question here, it's like, what as, a progressive would you like to see on the right? And then I'll say what on the right we would like to see out of progressives to help us know that we have an ally there in this question of sovereignty, or at least a better life for Western Canadians.
I'm more interested in your answer because I think this discussion is well developed on the right. And that's sort of been my attraction to having conversations with a number of conservatives where I wouldn't normally have done that, because those are the folks that are discussing this and making good points in the debate. And even if I disagree with a number of takes on things, I'm just delighted that people are having this conversation somewhere. And so you have to go where the conversation is taking place. And so, I mean, I could say things like, well, look, I think conservatives in this discussion have to be, you have to make more space for, especially in British Columbia, of opposing views on this with an intention to try to bring those people into the discussion closer so that we can find some basis of unity. And it's difficult in British Columbia, I think, because of those sort of historic tensions, political tensions between BC and some of the other Western provinces, because of sort of the higher level of progressivism that exists here. But again, I mean, that could just be my own perception of incorrect perception of conservatives as a progressive. So I hesitate to sort of give that advice to conservatives, because again, I think you're actually doing a better job of having this discussion, which is why I'm here. But I am curious about your take.
I think maybe as a concluding thought on my end, it's that ultimately, I think a lot of people on the right and we do paint progressives with the same brush, but I mean that's kind of what Twitter's done to this situation. Twitter has made it all look like all the blue checks are the same, right? They're all just going to come and get you and cancel you. I think
it's kind of true, actually. I have to admit.
So I mean, but in real life, I think the biggest thing is that it just as a conservative might be more pro-gun and a progressive is often more anti-gun, or those kind of watershed issues. Maybe a place to start is that any kind of issue is sought to be solved at the lowest possible level first, right? Which is I mean, we're going to keep referencing all these things. That's called subsidiarity, at least from the tradition I come from in Catholic social teaching. But subsidiarity, or the idea that there should be at least solidarity, maybe use the left-wing word, at the lowest possible level. So if I'm going to solve a problem in my neighborhood, I don't just start a campaign that I guess will solve all the problems in all the neighborhoods across the country, or I need to start some big activist thing. It's like, no, I need to go to my neighbor's house, knock on the door. I guess we are in COVID or whatever. Maybe I'll send them an email. The point is, I need to network with my neighbor and my next neighbor and the next guy down the street. And then that's how movements can start, right at the local level. I'm not saying that this doesn't happen on the left. Organization does happen like this on the left. But it needs to happen at even questions around, like, what are we going to do with this street? What are we going to do with garbage collection? What are we going to do about questions of noise complaints, or whether or not we support what this new infrastructure that's coming through? Because I feel like on the right, it just always seems like the left will immediately try and phone Ottawa,
right? Yeah, right.
Or Victoria, or Calgary, or Edmonton, or any of the Western provincial capitals, right, and Regina and Winnipeg, and so that they'll immediately get on the phone to a higher up, and instead of trying to actually have a conversation, with just someone on the level. Yeah.
No, that's absolutely true. No, that's good advice. So we'll see what we can do.
There you go. Well, again, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been my pleasure to do this inaugural show. I apologize for some of the technical difficulties we experienced during it, but thank you for your patience, and thank you for supporting the Western Standard. Of course, do take out a subscription if you can. Be sure to share this video and like this video. And again, we're looking for feedback. So please put comments on the video or send an email to me via the Western. You can find me on the Western. And I believe it's just ngiede at westernstandardonline.com. Though we are doing some stuff to our emails in the next couple of days here, so if I don't get back to you, I'm sorry. But that's kind of it, I guess. We're very thankful for your viewership. We're very thankful for your support. Please tell us how we can do better, and let's all move forward to a brighter future as Western Canadians.